The day Emma Brooks rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she was carrying three things: a carpetbag with a broken latch, a loaded derringer tucked into the folds of her skirt, and a reputation she had spent 24 years carefully, deliberately constructing out of nothing but quiet smiles and gentle words. Caldwell was a cattle town sitting right on the edge of the Chisholm Trail, loud and sun-bleached and smelling of livestock and ambition, and it greeted her the way such towns greeted every newcomer, with suspicion thinly dressed up as indifference. Men leaned against the posts of the general store and watched her ride past without turning their heads fully, which was its own kind of watching. A woman with brown hair the color of Autumn Creek water and eyes the pale gray of an overcast morning sky was either trouble or someone's wife, and since she was arriving alone, the general lean of opinion landed on trouble. She had come because her uncle, Harold Brooks, had written her a letter 6 months before his death, telling her he was leaving her his dry goods store on Front Street. He had been the only family she had left after her parents died of fever in Missouri when she was 19. She had spent the 5 years between then and now working as a seamstress in Wichita, sewing wedding dresses for other women, stitching their happiness together with silk thread, while her own life sat in a drawer like a folded piece of cloth nobody had any use for. Harold's letter had felt like a door opening. What the letter had not told her was that Harold had borrowed heavily against the store before he died, that the previous man running the store's accounts had absconded with 3 months of earnings, and that the building itself was in desperate need of a new roof before the summer rains arrived. She had learned all of this from Harold's solicitor, a thin, nervous man named Prentice, who had delivered the news with the expression of someone who expected to be screamed at and was preemptively flinching. Emma had not screamed. She had thanked him politely, folded his letter alongside Harold's into her carpetbag, and begun making a list in her head of everything she would need to do. That was the thing about Emma Brooks that people rarely understood when they first met her. They saw the soft way she spoke, the easy curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when she listened to someone as though their words were the most important sounds in the room. They saw a woman who seemed made entirely of gentleness, and they assumed that gentleness was all she was. They assumed that because she moved through the world without sharp edges, she had no spine beneath the softness. What they never saw, not on first acquaintance, not on second, was the iron running right down through the center of her. The absolute, unshakable stillness that sat in her chest, even when the rest of the world was falling to pieces around her. She had learned to keep that part of herself hidden very early in life, because the world did not particularly care for strong women, and a strong woman who also seemed soft was a woman who could get things done without frightening anybody. It was a survival strategy. It was also, she had begun to suspect after 24 years, something very close to loneliness. She pulled her horse up in front of the store on Front Street and looked at it for a long, quiet moment. The sign above the door read BROOKS, dry goods, in letters that had once been red and were now faded to the color of old brick. The window needed cleaning. There was a crack in the wooden step leading up to the door. Inside, through the dusty glass, she could see the dim shapes of shelves, most of them half empty. She climbed down from the horse, tied the reins to the post, and picked up her carpetbag. "You the new owner?" The voice came from the right, low and unhurried, carrying the particular kind of ease that belonged to men who spent a great deal of time outdoors. She turned. He was standing near the entrance of the livery stable 2 buildings down. One shoulder leaned against the post in a way that looked casual but wasn't, the way a man leans when he is actually paying close attention to something and trying not to show it. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from real work rather than vanity, with dark hair pushed back under a worn hat, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that might have been called rugged if you were being kind and merely lived in if you were not. He was perhaps 27, 28, though the outdoor life made precise aging difficult. His eyes, she noticed when he stepped slightly out of the shade, were the deep, warm brown of river-soaked wood. He was looking at her with a directness that was not rude and not forward, and not the kind of speculative male look she had grown accustomed to navigating. It was simply honest, as if he was genuinely asking the question he had asked and genuinely waiting for the answer. "I am," she said. He nodded, as though filing the information away somewhere useful. "Roof's bad," he said. "Back left corner, come the rains, you'll have water on your floor." "I know," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her for one more moment, then pushed off from the post and went back into the livery, and that was the end of the conversation. It was a brief exchange. It was nothing, really. And yet something about it stayed with her, as she unlocked the store and stepped inside and began the first assessment of what she had inherited. Something about the way he had looked at her, not through the softness, not past it, but at it, and somehow also at something behind it simultaneously, both things at once, without her having done anything to reveal the second thing at all. She told herself it was her imagination and got back to her list. His name was Micah Sutton, and she learned it from the livery stable owner, a broad, cheerful man named Walt Greer, when she went to arrange boarding for her horse that first evening. Micah Sutton was a cattle drover who had been stopping in Caldwell for the past 2 years, Walt told her, working drives up from Texas along the Chisholm, and wintering between seasons doing whatever needed doing around town. He helped at the livery sometimes. He did fence and carpentry work for the local ranchers. He was, Walt said with the particular admiration men reserve for other men they consider genuinely competent, good with his hands. He was not in the livery when she went. She did not look for him. She had a store to fix. The next 3 weeks were among the most demanding of Emma's life, and she had lived through some demanding stretches. She reopened for business on her 3rd day in Caldwell, because she could not afford to lose another week of income, even though the shelves were half-stocked and the back room was a disaster of Harold's disorganized inventory. She sold what she had, ordered more from the merchant supplier in Wichita, and spent her evenings reorganizing and cataloging with a lantern on the counter because the overhead light was not reliable. She charmed the creditors, which was the only honest word for it. She visited each of the men to whom Harold had owed money and sat across their desks with her soft gray eyes and her reasonable voice, and laid out exactly what she could pay each month and exactly when they could expect to be whole. And she made those numbers sound not like desperation, but like a sensible business proposition. 3 of the 4 men agreed immediately. The 4th, a bank officer named Clarence Hodge, who wore his self-importance like a too-tight collar, required 2 visits and a good deal of quiet patience before he came around. She hired a boy named Daniel, 14 years old and sharp as a new tack, to help with the store on Saturdays so she could manage the supply orders and the books herself during the week. She learned the names of the regular customers within a week, their usual needs within 2, and their personal preferences within 3. She remembered that old Mrs. Pierce liked her calico pre-washed because arthritis made it hard to wring cloth, and that the rancher Holt always needed a larger size of boot lace than he thought he did, and that the schoolteacher Miss Drummond preferred her writing paper in the larger quire even though it cost more. The town, which had been watching her with the quiet skepticism it extended to all newcomers, began to warm. Women came in not just for goods but to linger a little, drawn by something they probably couldn't have named precisely, which was that Emma listened to them the way people rarely did. Men came in and found that she was direct and fair, and did not try to oversell them things they did not need. She was building something. She could feel the shape of it emerging the way a dress emerges from fabric, the cuts made, the seams joined, the thing beginning to resemble what it was supposed to be. The roof was still bad. She had gotten one estimate from a local carpenter named Briggs that was more than she could manage right now without disrupting her payment schedule. She was sitting on the problem the way you sit on a river rock and watch the current, waiting for it to show you a way through, when Micah Sutton appeared in her doorway on a Tuesday morning in late April. He knocked on the door frame, even though the door was open. She looked up from the ledger she was working in behind the counter. "Miss Brooks," he said. He held his hat in his hands, which struck her as a surprisingly formal gesture from a man who wore ease as comfortably as he wore his shirt. "I heard you were looking to get the roof done. I have an estimate," she said. "I'm working on the timing of it." "Briggs charges too much," he said, without particular judgment, as if it was simply a fact about the weather. "I can do it for what the materials cost. I've got the time between drives." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the spring morning light behind him, hat in his hands, and he was not performing anything. He was not trying to impress her or make himself seem indispensable or maneuver her into gratitude. He was simply offering a practical solution to a practical problem, the way you hand someone a tool they need. "Why?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "Because a dry goods store the town actually needs shouldn't have water on the floor," he said. "And because Briggs charged my neighbor twice what the work was worth, and I don't like that kind of thing." She considered him for a moment. "I'll pay you for your labor," she said. "I'll pay you what I can right now, and the rest when the payments stabilize." "Fair enough," he said. He came back the next morning with the lumber and the tools, and climbed onto her roof with the confidence of a man who had been climbing onto roofs his entire life, which, she gathered from Walt Greer's collected knowledge of the man, was essentially true. He worked steadily and without drama, and the sounds of the repair were so regular and rhythmic above her head that after the first hour they became simply part of the background of the store, like the creak of the floorboards or the bell above the door. When she brought him water at midday, she did not make a fuss about it, and he did not either. He came down from the ladder, drank, thanked her in the same even tone he used for everything, and went back up. She went back to her ledger. This was the beginning of something she could not yet name. He finished the roof in 2 days. He told her it would hold through a decade of rains if she kept the gutters clear. She paid him what she had said she would pay him and wrote the remainder in her ledger under obligations, a column she kept fastidiously. He thanked her, loaded his tools onto his horse, and rode away, and Emma went back to the store and stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular. She was aware of a small but distinct warmth somewhere in the vicinity of her chest. She went back to work. He came into the store as a customer a week later, needing thread and a new canvas saddlebag, and they talked about the dry goods business and the upcoming cattle drive season. And she noticed that he spoke to her the way you speak to someone whose opinion you find genuinely interesting, asking questions and listening to the answers. It was the kind of conversation she had facilitated for other people most of her life without often getting it in return. When he left, the boy Daniel looked at her with 14-year-old straightforwardness and said, "He's sweet on you, Miss Brooks." "Daniel," she said, "go straighten the nails bin." But she was smiling into the ledger when he turned away. May arrived, and with it, the first real heat and the beginning of the cattle drive season. The town swelled with drovers passing through on their way north, and the store was busier than she had yet seen it, and Emma ran herself nearly to exhaustion keeping up with demand. She hired Daniel for 3 days a week instead of 1, and brought on a local woman, a widow named Ruth Cavanaugh, for the afternoon hours when the foot traffic was heaviest. Micah came in every few days for supplies, for conversation, sometimes apparently for no reason that she could identify beyond the fact that he seemed to like being there. He never lingered too long or made himself an inconvenience. He seemed to understand, without being told, the texture of how her days worked, and he fit himself into them with a kind of effortless consideration that she found, to her own mild alarm, she was beginning to depend on. One evening, near the end of May, he was in the store when she was trying to shift a heavy crate of iron goods that had been delivered to the wrong spot. She was managing it. She was always managing. But he appeared from where he'd been looking at boot leather and moved the crate with the casual ease of someone for whom physical effort was simply a language. And then they were both standing there in the orange evening light coming through the window, and she said, without planning to, "You keep showing up when things need doing." "I keep noticing things that need doing," he said, and the simplicity of it made her laugh. A real laugh, not the polite social one she had perfected, and the sound of it surprised them both, she thought. He was looking at her in that way he had the way she had noticed on the very first day, standing by the livery, seeing both things, the softness and whatever was behind it. She still had not figured out how he did that, and she had been studying it with the same careful attention she brought to her ledger columns. "Would you take supper with me?" he asked. "At the hotel dining room, Saturday evening if you're not too tired." She looked at him for a moment, then said, "I'd like that." He nodded. Not triumphant, not relieved, just steady, the way he was about everything. "Saturday then," he said, picked up the boot leather he'd been looking at, paid for it, and left. Emma stood in the middle of her store in the warm evening light and felt something rearranging itself inside her chest, something she had kept very carefully in its correct and useful place for a very long time. She told Ruth about the dinner the next day, because Ruth was the kind of woman who found out about things anyway and was better handled with information than left to discover them independently. Ruth was 43 and had been a widow for 6 years, and had the specific wisdom that comes from having both loved and lost, and decided to keep going anyway. She listened to Emma's careful, measured description of the situation, took a long sip of the coffee she had brought to work in a tin cup, and said, "Lord, child, you like him." "I find him," Emma said, arranging bolts of fabric with perhaps unnecessary precision, "agreeable." "You were smiling before you started talking," Ruth said. "Agreeable doesn't do that." Emma turned to look at her. Ruth smiled at her coffee cup and said nothing else, because she was also, in her own way, a woman who knew when she had made her point. Saturday came. Emma wore the best dress she had, which was a dark blue cotton that brought out the gray in her eyes and fit her well and made her feel, she had always thought, like a person who had her life in some kind of order. She pinned her brown hair up with care, and she stood in the small mirror in her room above the store and looked at her own reflection for a moment, and what she felt was not excitement exactly, though excitement was part of it. What she felt most was something closer to curiosity. About what it would be like to sit across a table from someone who looked at her the way Micah Sutton looked at her, and find out if it meant what she thought it might. The hotel dining room was the nicest establishment in Caldwell, which in 1879 was not saying an enormous amount, but it was clean and well lit and the food was good, and on Saturday evenings there was a man playing piano in the corner. Micah was there when she arrived, standing near the door, and he had made an effort, clean shirt, hair combed, hat in his hands again, which she was coming to recognize as a tell of his, the hat coming off when something mattered to him. He looked, she thought, very like himself, only slightly more polished, and there was something deeply appealing about a man who cleaned up without losing the essential quality of who he was. He held her chair. They ordered. The piano played something soft. What she discovered over the next 2 hours was that Micah Sutton was a man of serious substance behind the quiet exterior. He had grown up in Central Texas, the second of 4 children, son of a cattle rancher who had built and lost and rebuilt his spread twice before Micah was old enough to drive cattle himself. He had been doing drives since he was 15, had seen most of the major trail towns between Texas and Kansas, and had the wide, well-worn knowledge of the land that belonged to men who had spent years moving across it. He asked about her life in Missouri, her parents, her work in Wichita. He listened with his whole attention, the way she listened to other people, and she found that being on the receiving end of that kind of listening was both more comfortable and more disarming than she had anticipated. She told him more than she usually told people. She told him about the 5 years in Wichita, the loneliness of sewing wedding dresses, the letter from Harold. She did not tell him about the iron in her spine, because that was not the kind of thing you said. But she had the distinct, unsettling sensation that he already knew. "You've built something real here in a very short time," he said, near the end of the meal, and it was not flattery the way men performed flattery, angling for something. It was an observation, an honest one. Most people in your situation would have sold the store and gone back to wherever they came from. I didn't have a wherever, she said, and the honesty of it surprised even her a little. He looked at her for a moment. Maybe you're building one, he said. She looked back at him and felt, in that moment, with the piano playing something old and quiet, and the orange lamp light making everything warm, that she had been seen very nearly entirely. Not just the softness and not just the iron, but the specific and private combination of them that was the actual Emma Brooks, the real one, the one she kept so carefully managed. It was, she decided, on the walk back to the store with him at her side, and the Kansas night sky stretched absolutely enormous above them, absolutely terrifying. It was also, she decided, absolutely worth it. He walked her to her door. He did not try to kiss her. He said, "Thank you for the evening, Miss Brooks," and she said, "Emma," and he said, "Emma," and the sound of her name in his voice was a whole different thing than it was in anyone else's. June came in hot and dry and brilliant. Micah was preparing for a drive north and would be gone for several weeks, and the knowledge of his departure sat in Emma's chest with more weight than she cared to examine. They had taken 2 more dinners together, and several evening walks along the edge of town, where the prairie opened up, and the sunsets were wide and extravagant, full of color that seemed excessive and was exactly right. They had talked for hours about everything and nothing, the way people talk when they are learning each other. On the morning he was set to leave, he came into the store. There were 2 other customers, and he waited until they had been served and left. Then he came to the counter and looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "I'll be back by late July," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He reached across the counter gently and his hand covered hers for a moment, just a moment. The warmth of it traveled up her arm and settled somewhere near her heart. "I know you will be," he said. He left, and she watched him through the dusty window as he mounted his horse and rode south with the other drovers, and the town went back to its ordinary sounds, and Emma went back to her ledger, and the numbers swam for a moment before she blinked them back into focus. She was in love with him. She had been aware of it assembling itself for weeks, the way a storm assembles on the horizon, first just a darkening, then definition, then the whole inevitable reality of it. She could have stopped it, she thought. She probably could have kept herself from this with sufficient effort. She chose not to because, for the first time in a very long time, she had found something that was hers and not a construction, not a careful performance, not a thing she was doing because it was useful. This was simply, purely, entirely her own. She folded the feeling up and put it somewhere safe and ran her store with everything she had. July was a good month. The supply chain from Wichita stabilized. She was able to make a double payment to Clarence Hodge at the bank, which produced in him an expression of reluctant respect that she found privately satisfying. She hired Ruth Kavanaugh full-time, which doubled her capacity during busy hours and freed her to develop the relationships with her suppliers that would give her better terms in the long run. She repainted the sign above the door herself, on a Sunday morning, standing on the step in her work dress with red paint and a brush, and Daniel watched from below and told her she'd missed a spot on the second S, and she told him that was his opinion and he could have it. Old Mrs. Pierce told her she reminded her of her own daughter, who was out in California. The schoolteacher, Miss Drummond, came in twice a week just to talk. The rancher Holt shook her hand when she sourced a specific harness fitting he had been unable to get anywhere else in the county. The banker Hodge, in a moment that represented a considerable shift in his personal universe, stopped to tip his hat to her on Front Street. She was building something. Micah came back in late July as he had said he would, and she was in the middle of helping a woman choose between 2 bolts of fabric when she heard his voice in the store. He had come in, seen her occupied, and was talking to Daniel about the drive, and the sound of it produced in her chest a feeling she had no useful category for, something between relief and joy, and the particular sweetness of something returning that you had not fully admitted to yourself you were waiting for. She finished with her customer, turned, and he was there, And he looked the same and also different in the way that people look different when you have been missing them without knowing how much more real, somehow more dimensional, like stepping from a sketch into a full portrait. "Welcome back," she said. "It's good to be back," he said, and the way he said it, looking directly at her, left no ambiguity about what exactly was good about it. They went to dinner that evening, and then on a walk, and at some point during the walk he stopped on the edge of the open prairie with the Kansas stars enormous above them and said, "I've been thinking about you. Every day." "I've been thinking about you too," she said, which was an understatement on a par with calling the prairie large. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you'll have me." She turned to look at him fully. He was standing in the starlight, hat in his hands, and he looked. She searched for the word earnest, not performed, not strategic. He meant it with all of himself. "Yes," she said, "I will." He smiled, and it transformed his face in a way she had been getting glimpses of for months and now saw completely. Not the restrained half-smile she had grown accustomed to, but the full thing, warm and genuine and a little wondering, as if some part of him had not been entirely certain of the answer. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the tips of his fingers, gently, and she stood very still and let herself feel it. They walked back to town, and he held her hand, and neither of them said much, because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already perfectly clear. Courting, in Caldwell in 1879, had specific social dimensions. It meant that people noticed. It meant that Mrs. Pierce beamed at Emma every time she came into the store. It meant that Walt Greer slapped Micah on the back so hard it left a mark. It meant that Ruth Kavanaugh said, "I told you so," every single morning for 2 weeks running, which Emma accepted with the grace of a woman who knew when she had been correctly read. Micah was a careful and attentive courter. He came to the store most days, sometimes briefly, sometimes for longer. He brought her things he thought she would find interesting, a particular wildflower he'd found on a ride, a small smooth stone from the river with an unusual color, a book of maps that he knew she studied because she was always trying to understand the geography of the trade routes. He fixed the creak in her floorboards without being asked. He built shelves in the storeroom because there were not enough. He did these things without making them into transactions, without expecting gratitude performed back at him. He did them because he wanted to, and the wanting was clean and simple and undemanding. She gave back in her own language. She saved back the good cuts of dried beef from the supply shipments before they hit the counter. She remembered things he mentioned in passing and acted on them weeks later. She argued with him about trail navigation and the economics of cattle driving with the full force of her intelligence, not the politely softened version she had trained herself to deploy. And the first time she laid out a genuine counterargument and pushed back hard on something he said, he got quiet for a moment and then looked at her with something in his expression that was very close to delight. "You've been holding back," he said. She felt herself go slightly still. "What do you mean?" "You're smarter than you let on in general," he said, not accusingly, just observationally. "I've thought so since the first day." "Since the first day," she repeated, and the echo of it moved through her like a current. "Since the first day," he said. "I didn't say anything because I figured you had your reasons." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the store window and laying itself across the counter and across his hands and across his face. And she thought about how long she had been doing this, keeping the fullness of herself in careful reserve, offering the world the version that created the least resistance. And she thought about how strange and extraordinary it was that this particular man had seen through the version on the very first day and said nothing, just filed it away and waited, and had not been threatened or confused by it, but had simply and quietly admired the whole of it. "I had my reasons," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't need them with me." She came around from behind the counter, and she stood in front of him, and she looked up at him, and she said, with every intention of being heard completely, "I know that now." He kissed her then, for the first time, there in the warm afternoon light of her store with the dust motes turning in the air around them, and it was the gentlest and most certain thing she had ever felt. August was something else entirely. August brought trouble, and it came in the form of a man named Chester Pyle, who arrived in Caldwell with a piece of paper from a lawyer in Wichita claiming that Harold Brooks had used the store property as collateral on a loan that Emma had not known about, separate from the debts she had already addressed, and that the loan had come due, and that Mr. Pyle was the current holder of that note and expected to be paid immediately or to take possession of the property. Emma read the paper twice in the small office at the back of the store. Her hands were steady. She asked Chester Pyle, who was a heavy, slick-looking man in an expensive suit that was wrong for the climate, to give her 3 days to consult with her solicitor. He smiled. It was not a nice smile. 2 days, he said. When he left, Ruth looked at Emma with worried eyes. Emma picked up her ledger and began to work through the numbers with the particular ferocity she reserved for problems that truly mattered. Micah found out that evening when she told him, sitting on the steps behind the store with the warm night around them and the lantern light coming through the back window. She told him flatly and completely all of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Let me look into Pyle," he said. "I need to look into the legal basis first," she said. "Whether the note is legitimate." "I'll do both," he said. "You know this territory, Emma, but I know some of the men who move through it. If Pyle is a legitimate creditor, we deal with it. If he's something else, we deal with that differently." She looked at him. "We," she said. "We," he said, absolutely without hesitation. She felt something shift in her, something deep and structural. She had managed her own problems her entire life, managed them well, managed them alone. And she was not about to become a woman who handed her burdens to someone else to carry. But this, the easy, unquestioned inclusion of himself in her difficulty, not as a takeover but as a genuine partnership, this was something different from the offers of help that wanted credit. This was just two people who were serious about each other facing something serious. "All right," she said, "we." What Micah found, through a network of acquaintances built over years on the trail, was that Chester Pyle had a history in 3 Kansas cattle towns of acquiring debt instruments from estates under questionable circumstances and pressuring inheritors to sell rather than pay, because selling produced a larger return than payment. He was not, strictly speaking, breaking the law. He was exploiting the gaps in it. Emma's solicitor Prentice confirmed that the note itself appeared valid, which meant the debt was real. But Prentice also confirmed that the note's terms included a provision easy to miss, buried in the back of the document in language of impressive density, that allowed for a payment extension of 60 days if requested in writing within the 2-day window Pyle had given her. She was in Prentice's office when she read that provision. She read it twice to be certain. Then she folded the document closed, stood up, straightened her dress, thanked Prentice, and walked to the hotel where Chester Pyle was staying. She knocked on the door of his room, and when he opened it, she handed him a letter she had written in the hallway outside, formally requesting the 60-day extension as provided for in the terms of the note, signed and dated and witnessed by Prentice's secretary, who was waiting in the lobby below. Pyle read the letter. The genial slickness went out of his expression like a lamp being turned down. "You had 24 hours, he said. "And I used them," she said pleasantly. "You'll find everything in order." "Good day, Mr. Pyle." She walked back down the stairs, out into the bright August morning, and stood on the boardwalk and let out one long, slow breath. Micah was waiting outside the hotel. He had not gone in with her because she had not asked him to, and he had understood without explanation that she needed to do this part herself. He read her face when she came out and knew immediately. "Done," he said. "Done," she confirmed. He picked her up off the ground, actually lifted her, and swung her once, and she made a sound that was entirely undignified and absolutely joyful. And then he set her back down, and they were both laughing in the August sunlight on Front Street with half of Caldwell watching, and she found that she did not mind that at all. 60 days was time to save the money. She could not do it from the store's income alone at the current rate, So she thought about it the way she thought about all her problems, systematically, creatively, from every angle. She increased her ordering of the specialty goods that had the highest margins. She took on a consignment arrangement with a local hat maker who had beautiful work and no distribution. She negotiated a storage rental arrangement with two of the large ranchers who needed secure space for small equipment between seasons, using Harold's underused back room. The town helped in ways that were quiet and large. Mrs. Pierce spread the word among the women's social circle, which in a small western town in 1879 was a communication network of startling efficiency. Miss Drummond organized her students' families to make a point of buying their school supplies from Brooks Dry Goods. Walt Greer told every driver who passed through Caldwell that the best supplies in the territory were at Emma Brooks's store, and cowboys and drovers were a reliable transmission vector for information of all kinds. When 60 days were up, Emma walked to the bank, withdrew the sum, walked to Chester Pyle's hotel, paid the note in full in the presence of Prentice as witness, and received her receipt. Pyle looked at her with the expression of a man who had miscalculated seriously, which was its own kind of satisfaction. She walked back to the store and turned the sign to open and went to work. Ruth brought cake. Daniel had put up a small banner, somewhat crookedly, that said Brooks Dry Goods in letters that were enthusiastic if not geometrically perfect. Emma looked at the banner and felt something vast and warm moving through her chest. The summer turned to fall. The cattle drive slowed as autumn came, and the trail traffic thinned and Caldwell settled into the quieter rhythm of the off-season. The big heat gave way to something golden and cooling, and the light changed, and the prairie outside town went from summer green to the amber and brown of the fall grasses, and it was beautiful in the way that most beautiful things are, specifically, individually, belonging to the place they came from. Micah was not leaving for Texas for the winter. He had been talking over the previous months with one of the local ranchers, a man named Sam Ellery, about a partnership of sorts helping Ellery with the fall roundup and the winter management of the herd in exchange for a stake in the operation, and eventually, a piece of land of his own. Ellery was 62 and had no children and needed someone who could handle the ranch work and eventually take it forward. Micah had been thinking about stopping moving for a while. He told Emma about the arrangement on an October evening when they were walking along the creek south of town with the last gold light fading off the water and the cottonwood trees going yellow above them. He told her plainly and completely, which was how he told her everything. "Stopping moving," she said, testing the phrase. "Been driving cattle for 12 years, he said. "The trail's a good life, but it's not a settled one, and I'm finding I want something settled." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He turned to face her, and the last golden light was on his face and in his eyes, and he was not holding his hat in his hands because his hat was on his head, so his hands were at his sides, and they looked a little lost without the hat to hold, which struck her as the most endearing thing she had seen in her life. "I want to be here," he said. "I want to be here because of you. I want to build something with you, Emma, if that's something you want." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved and the cottonwood leaves moved and the last light moved across his face, and she was aware in that moment, with the absolute clarity that comes to certain pivotal instants, of the full weight of everything he was offering. Not just partnership, not just presence, but the specific and genuine thing of being known, of being the Emma who was both soft and iron, both gracious and fierce, both careful and bold, and being wanted for all of it, not one part of it, not the version she had constructed for the world, but the actual full, complicated, true version. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." He crossed the space between them in one step and kissed her with his hands on either side of her face, and she put her hands on his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and honest. And the creek moved, and the cottonwood leaves moved, and the light finished fading from the water and the stars began to come out. And Emma Brooks, who had kept her strength hidden behind softness her whole life, and who had just been seen completely for the first time. Held on to Micah Sutton and felt nothing like being hidden at all. Autumn moved through Caldwell with the unhurried grace that characterized the season on the plains. The last of the drovers passed through heading south, and the town contracted to its winter population, and the shorter days and longer evenings had a warmth to them that Emma found she had not expected, or rather, had not had reason to expect before this particular autumn. There was something different about the season when you were not alone in it. Micah split his time between the Ellery Ranch and Caldwell, coming to town most evenings. He and Sam Ellery were working through the winter details of the ranch partnership, and the arrangement was taking shape. Micah would earn a portion of the winter earnings and a formal stake in the spring, with the understanding that as Ellery's health continued to ease toward retirement, the ranch would increasingly become Micah's responsibility. The land itself was 3 miles south of town, rolling ground with good water from the same creek that ran past the cottonwoods where they walked, and Micah had been talking about the spring as though it was a door he could already see the shape of through the wall. One evening in November he took her out to the land for the first time, not the ranch buildings which were Ellery's house and barns, but a section of the property that ran along the creek, a piece of high ground with good drainage, and a stand of cottonwoods, and a view of the prairie that on a clear day seemed to reach approximately to the edge of the world. He was quiet while she walked around in the dry winter grass and stood at the edge of the creek bank and looked at things. She knew what she was being shown. She was being asked, without words, whether she could see it too. She stood at the top of the small rise and looked at the view for a long time. The November light was low and brilliant, the kind that exists only in autumn and only in open country, and it laid itself across the grass and the water and the far distance in a way that made everything look like a painting of itself, only better. "There's good level ground here," she said, "for building." "There is," he said beside her. "And the water's close," she said. "Year-round creek," he said, "never runs dry." "How many rooms were you thinking?" she said. She heard him breathe, a short, sharp breath, as though he had been bracing for a longer conversation and had not expected to arrive at the destination so quickly. "As many as we need," he said. "For whatever family we end up with." She turned to look at him. He was standing with his hat finally off his head, held against his chest, and he looked. She searched for the word like a man who had found the exact right place to put something he had been carrying for a long time. "Micah," she said. "Emma," he said. "You're going to have to actually ask me," she said, with the soft corner of a smile. He laughed, a real laugh, rare and wonderful, and then he looked at her with all the warmth and steadiness and honest wanting that had been quietly accumulating in his eyes for months and said, "Emma Brooks, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without qualification, without the careful measured response she had trained herself to give to everything. Just yes, simple and complete and exactly right. He put the hat back on his head and kissed her, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled over the winter prairie, and the creek ran and the grass moved, and it was the kind of moment that does not feel like it will be remembered forever but is. They married in December, in the small white church at the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, on a day that was cold and perfectly clear, with a sky so blue it looked implausible. Emma wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks since the engagement, ivory cotton with small blue flowers embroidered along the neckline, stitched in the evenings after the store closed while Ruth sat with her and talked and kept her company. It was the finest piece of sewing she had ever done, and she had done it for herself, which was the best possible reason for good work. Ruth stood with her. Walt Greer stood with Micah. Sam Ellery sat in the front pew and looked like a man deeply pleased by the way things had turned out. Mrs. Pierce cried, as she had clearly planned to do, and produced a handkerchief from her sleeve with the preparedness of someone who had been carrying it for weeks in anticipation of the occasion. Daniel sat in the second row in a suit that was slightly too large for him and had the expression of someone attempting dignity and mostly achieving it. Miss Drummond had organized the women's choir to sing, and they did beautifully. The ceremony was simple and direct, performed by the minister Reverend Hale, who had been doing weddings in Caldwell for 15 years, and delivered the words with a warmth that made it clear he meant them as more than recitation. When Micah said his vows, he said them looking directly into Emma's eyes, not performing them at the room but saying them to her and only her, with the same clean directness he brought to everything. And she said hers back to him and felt every word of them all the way through. When Reverend Hale said, "You may kiss your bride," Micah kissed her gently and then pulled back and just looked at her for a moment. And what was in his expression was the most uncomplicated thing she had ever seen on a human face. Happiness, pure and full, entirely unguarded. She felt it too, and she did not try to be careful about it. The town celebrated with them in the way small Western towns celebrate things that please them, which is completely and with great dedication. The hotel dining room had been reserved for the evening, and what followed was loud and warm and went on longer than weddings usually do, because nobody seemed to want to be the first to leave, and the piano player appeared to be working from an inexhaustible personal reserve of songs. Micah danced with her, carefully and not with any great technical skill, but with a kind of sincere effort that made up for what it lacked in elegance. And she put her head on his shoulder during the slower songs and felt, for the first time in her entire adult life, exactly where she was supposed to be. They spent their first nights as a married couple in the rooms above the store, because the house on the creek land was something that would take time to build, and they were realistic people who understood that time and patience were not enemies, but just the material everything good was made from. The rooms were warm and comfortable, and they had made them so together over the previous months, and that felt, in its way, exactly right. Winter moved through the plains with the unhurried authority it had always had over everything, and Emma and Micah Sutton settled into the particular rhythm of a life shared. She ran the store and he worked the Ellery Ranch, and they came together in the evenings with the easy relief of people who had found their natural counterpart and are still slightly amazed by it. They argued sometimes because they were both people of strong opinion, and the arguments were real and not polite, and always ended in actual resolution rather than the false peace of one person backing down, which was the best kind of argument you could have with someone. She told him, on a winter evening when snow was coming down outside, and the stove was warm and they were sitting with coffee after supper, about the years of hiding. Not just the strength behind the softness that she had mentioned in pieces before, but the full history of it, the tactical decision she had made very young, the way she had learned to use perception as a tool, the loneliness of being seen only as what you chose to show. He listened with the completeness he always listened with. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she waited, accustomed by now to the way he processed things before he spoke. "Must have been very tiring," he said, "being careful all the time." "It was," she said, "and I was good at it, which made it worse, because being good at something has its own gravity." "You don't do it with me," he said, and it was not a question. "No," she said. "I know," he said. "I noticed a pause first day," she laughed. "You have said that before." "It's still true," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. The snow came down outside and the stove ticked and they were quiet together, and it was the kind of quiet that is its own kind of fullness. Spring announced itself in the way springs always do on the Kansas plains, first with a warming in the wind's direction, then with mud, then with the prairie grass coming up green and insistent and unstoppable through all the brown of winter, and then all at once with wildflowers covering the low ground in colors that seemed, after the long flat gray of January and February, almost alarming in their cheerfulness. Micah had spent the winter planning the house. He had drawn plans on paper, revised them, drawn them again, consulted with Emma at every stage, revised them again. He knew what he was doing in a technical sense. He had built structures before and understood load and drainage and foundation, and he approached the project with the same methodical steadiness he brought to all practical work. But he also wanted it to be hers, in the same way the store was hers, something that reflected the real person and not a construction. She had opinions. He had expected this and been right about it. She wanted the windows large for the light. She wanted the kitchen placed for the eastern morning sun. She wanted a room for the store's overflow accounts and ordering a workspace, not a parlor. And she explained why with the same thoroughness she explained everything, and he looked at the plans and moved things and made it work. The house that took shape on the paper and then, through the spring and early summer, took shape in lumber and stone on the rise above the creek, was a house built by two people who both had strong ideas and had learned how to combine them. Walt Greer's son came to help on weekends. Two of Ellery's ranch hands contributed days. Daniel, who was 15 now and growing into something impressively capable, showed up every Saturday without being asked and worked harder than men twice his size. The town turned out, in the way it had, with the kind of practical community generosity that was one of the genuine goods of the life in a small western town in that time and place. It was not simple, the Wild West life, and it carried real injustice in its bones. The land taken, the treaties broken, the people pushed out and pushed down to make way for the settling of the frontier, things that sat at the edge of Emma's awareness the way a dark cloud sits at the edge of a blue sky. She held that knowledge with a kind of honest grief, but within it, and alongside it, there were also things like this, people building a house together because two of their own needed one. The house was ready by late June. They moved in on a Saturday, carrying their belongings through the afternoon heat with the prairie breeze moving through the cottonwoods and the creek running below and the new wood smell of the house meeting them at the door. It was not large, but it was well made and warm and entirely theirs. And when they had brought the last box in and set it down and stood in the middle of the main room together in the early evening light, Emma looked around at the large windows with the prairie framed in them like paintings and the kitchen in its eastern position, and the small room off the main floor where her desk and ledgers and order books would live, and she felt something she could only describe as a rival. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's yours," he said. "Ours," she said. "Ours," he agreed, with the warmth she had grown to love the most in him, the warmth that was entirely without qualification. The store continued to grow. By the late summer of 1880, Emma had expanded the inventory to include a wider range of ready-made clothing, which she sourced carefully for quality and priced fairly, and which became particularly popular with the women of the surrounding farms and ranches who had less time for the heavy work of home sewing than they once had. She had established a reliable credit arrangement with two of the larger Wichita suppliers that gave her better terms than most stores of her size, the result of 2 years of consistent payment and the specific kind of trust that builds between parties who have been honest with each other. She also wrote, that summer, to a woman she had heard of in Abilene, a woman running her own millinery and notions shop, one of very few female business owners in the cattle towns, and a correspondence began that would become, over the following years, both a professional resource and a genuine friendship. Her name was Clara Webb, and she was sharp and funny and had built her business with the same combination of soft presentation and iron backbone that Emma recognized immediately. In their first letter, Clara wrote, "I have found that the men around me generally underestimate what they are dealing with when they look at me, and I have found this more useful than offensive." Emma read it and laughed for a solid minute and wrote back, "I married a man who did not underestimate me for even one day, and I recommend it highly if you can find one." The ranch partnership with Sam Ellery formalized that summer as well, and Micah's stake in the operation became a matter of paper and law, which Ellery had insisted on with the particular insistence of an old man who wanted things done properly before time took away his ability to do them properly. Ellery's health was slower than it had been, though his mind remained sharp, and he came to dinner at the house on the creek sometimes on Sunday evenings, and he and Emma played chess on the porch while Micah dealt with whatever needed dealing with on the range. And Ellery always won and never let her forget it. And she always demanded a rematch, and they were both generally satisfied with this arrangement. In October of 1880, Emma told Micah she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before work. She had known for 2 weeks and had spent those 2 weeks being quietly certain before saying anything, because that was her way. He was standing at the stove and he turned when she spoke, and she watched the information arrive in his face in stages: first comprehension, then a kind of dazed wondering, then, starting slowly and spreading everywhere, the pure unguarded happiness she had first seen on their wedding day. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. "Emma," he said. "Micah," she said. "We're going to need to expand the house," he said, which was so characteristic of him, so immediately practical in its response to the overwhelming, that she burst out laughing against his shoulder while he held her. "You're not wrong," she said. He kissed her hair. She could feel him smiling. Spring of 1881 brought both the house expansion and, 2 weeks before the expansion was finished, the baby. He arrived on a morning in April, in the bedroom of the house above the creek, with Ruth Cavanaugh and the town doctor present and Micah somewhere between the barn and the porch, because Ruth had sensibly sent him outside on the grounds that pacing the hallway was not useful to anyone. He came back in when Ruth opened the door and told him it was done. He was a boy. 7 pounds and 10 ounces, with dark hair and gray eyes that would, Ruth pronounced, almost certainly change, though in fact they never did, staying that clear pale gray that was so entirely his mother's. Micah stood at the bedside and looked at this small new person with an expression that Emma, watching him from her exhausted happiness, had never seen before on anyone's face, a kind of reverent astonishment, as if the universe had just revealed a mechanism that had been operating out of sight all along and was considerably more extraordinary than anything he had imagined. "Hello," Micah said quietly, to the baby, as if he was greeting someone important. The baby, whose eyes were open and whose expression contained the focused ancient blankness of all newborns, looked at him without any particular reaction. "He'll warm up to you," Emma said from the pillows. Micah looked up at her with those warm brown eyes, and what was in them was so full and so clear that she felt it as a physical thing moving through her chest. "What do we call him?" he said. They had discussed names in the months of waiting, in the way that expecting parents discuss names, with the combination of seriousness and silliness that the task seems to require. They had a list. They had a short list. They had a top name that both of them privately favored but had not fully committed to, because naming felt like a thing you should do when the person was actually there. "James," she said. "James Harold Sutton." James for Micah's father, who had built and lost and rebuilt and taught his son something essential about persistence. Harold for Uncle Harold, who had opened a door when he was gone that he might not fully have been able to open while he was living. The combination felt right. It felt like the past held gently, the way you hold something valuable that belongs to many people. "James Harold Sutton," Micah repeated and looked at his son, and the baby made a small sound that could have been anything and was probably just a baby sound, but that Micah received as a response. "He agrees," Micah said. Emma laughed softly and closed her eyes for a moment, and felt the weight of her husband's hand over hers, and heard the creak below the house, and heard the new room for James not quite finished yet, the last boards going up next week, and felt the whole of her life arranged around her with a completeness she could not have described to anyone who had not lived something like it. James Harold Sutton grew. He grew with the enthusiastic dedication of all healthy babies, demanding and rewarding in equal measure, learning to smile and then to sit, and then to pull himself upright on the edge of furniture with an expression of concentrated determination that was his father's exactly. He had his mother's coloring and his father's physical steadiness, and it became clear very early on, his own considerable personality opinionated, affectionate, curious about everything, and possessed of a laugh that, when it came, seemed too large for him and delighted everyone who heard it. The store was managed through James's first year with the help of Ruth, who had essentially become indispensable, and who treated the whole Sutton family with the warm, slightly proprietorial affection of someone who had seen things coming before the people involved, had seen them coming, and felt entitled to a small ongoing satisfaction about this. Daniel, 16 and capable and increasingly useful, took on more responsibility, and Emma began to see in him the shape of someone who would eventually be able to manage the store himself on the days she needed to be elsewhere. Micah worked the ranch through that year with the full partnership now firmly in place, Ellery's involvement narrowing gradually to consultation and occasional chess on Sunday evenings. The cattle operation was modest but solid, and Micah ran it with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. No drama, no gambling on uncertain things, steady work and honest dealing, and the kind of reputation that made men want to do business with you rather than around you. He and Emma reviewed the finances of both operations together on Sunday evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with James asleep in the next room, their heads together over ledgers that increasingly told a story of something genuinely built. In the fall of 1882, Ellery died peacefully in his sleep, which was, everyone agreed, exactly what he would have chosen if he had been given options. He had written his will with care, and had left the full ranch property to Micah with a letter that said, in Ellery's characteristic directness, that he had watched Micah for 2 years before offering the partnership, and he had never for one moment doubted that the land would be well kept. He left a smaller bequest to the church and a set of silver candlesticks to Emma, because she had beaten him at chess twice in the final year of his life, and he respected that. She put the candlesticks on the mantelpiece, and they were there every day after. Micah buried Ellery on the ranch property, on a rise with a view of the range, which was what Ellery had specified in the letter. It was a quiet burial, attended by the hands and by Micah and Emma and James, who at a year and a half did not entirely understand what was happening, but was solemn in his small way as though he understood that the grown-ups needed him to be, which was one of the first signs of the particular emotional intelligence that would characterize him as he grew. Micah stood at the grave after the others had gone back to the house, and Emma stood with him. He did not say anything for a long time. She did not require him to. He gave me something, Micah said finally, more than the land. I know, she said. He showed me what it looks like when a man decides what he's going to build and just goes ahead and builds it, he said. Stayed with it his whole life, didn't let the hard parts undo it. You've already learned that, she said quietly. He looked at her. I had a better teacher than I knew I had, he said. When I met you, you had already been doing that your whole life, building things, not letting the hard parts undo them. She held his gaze for a moment in the late fall afternoon, with the Kansas prairie stretching out below the rise in every direction, the sky enormous and blue, the dry grass moving. She thought about the girl in Wichita stitching someone else's happiness. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Caldwell with a broken carpetbag and a loaded derringer and a careful smile. She thought about all the hard parts she had not let undo her, and all the parts she had not shown anyone, and the man standing beside her who had seen them from the very first day and said nothing and simply admired all of it. We both came by it honestly, she said. He took her hand. They stood there for another minute, and the grass moved, and the sky was full of light. James turned 2 in April of 1883, and the party Emma threw for him in the backyard of the house on the creek was attended by what seemed like most of Caldwell, because James had already, at 2 years old, managed to charm virtually every person he had encountered, and the general feeling in town was one of affectionate investment in his development. Mrs. Pierce brought a cake. Miss Drummond brought books, because she had strong feelings about the age at which children should begin accumulating books. Daniel came with his younger sister and spent the entire party chasing 2-year-olds, which he did with with the good-natured competence of someone who had several younger siblings himself and was immune to chaos. Emma stood at the edge of the backyard in the April afternoon and watched her son run through the grass with the Drummond children, and listened to the voices of her neighbors, and felt the warm weight of the life she had built, and thought about how a life like this had once felt like something that happened to other people. She was 28 years old and running a growing business and raising a child and living in a house above a creek on the Kansas plains with a man who had seen her completely on the first day and never once asked her to be less than she was. And she decided, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had put her here, because she had gotten herself here, with everything she had, iron and softness in equal measure. Ruth appeared at her elbow with a cup of cider and said, "You've got that look again." "What look?" Emma said. "The one where you're thinking something true," Ruth said. "You always get very still when you're thinking something true." Emma looked at her and then laughed. "When did you get so observant?" she said. "I've been watching you for 4 years," Ruth said. "Pay attention long enough to anybody and you start to see things." Emma thought of Micah saying first day, and the quiet pleasure of being consistently known moved through her. "I'm thinking about how this isn't the life I expected," she said. "It's better." Ruth nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who had been expecting this particular conclusion for a very long time. "It always is," she said, "when you build it yourself." Micah was there beside her a moment later, having come from wherever he had been, with James on his hip and James's hair full of grass from what appeared to have been a recent tumble that had upset no one involved. James was pointing at something in the middle distance with the authoritative gesturing of a 2-year-old who has identified something of great importance, and Micah was dutifully looking in the direction of the point. "He's showing me the bird," Micah explained. "I see," Emma said. "It is, objectively, a good bird," Micah said. James looked at his mother with his pale gray eyes, her own eyes returned in a new and extraordinary face, and said with great seriousness, "Bird." "Bird," Emma agreed. James appeared satisfied. He laid his head against his father's shoulder with the casual confidence of a child who has never had cause to doubt the reliability of that shoulder, and Micah shifted him slightly, and looked at Emma over their son's head with those steady, warm brown eyes. And what was in them was the full and unguarded thing she had first seen on their wedding day: happiness, pure and complete, entirely without qualification. The bird, apparently done being observed, flew away into the April sky. By the fall of 1883, Emma and Micah had begun to talk about James having a sibling, which was a conversation they had been circling toward for a year in the comfortable way that people circle toward things when there is no urgency but real desire. The store was stable enough now that Emma could manage the demands of a second child, alongside it with Ruth's help and Daniel's increasing capability. The ranch was producing well. The house had room, and the creek had room, and there was more than enough to offer another small person. Clara Webb from Abilene had come to visit twice that year, and the two women had stayed up both times until the small hours of the morning, talking with the specific intensity of women who found each other deeply interesting and did not get enough of that in ordinary life. Clara had looked at the store and at the house and at Emma's marriage and at Emma herself and had said, in her direct Abilene way, "You are the most deliberately happy person I have ever met." Emma had thought about this for a while. "I think the deliberate part is the point," she had finally said. "I decided to make something and then I made it. The happiness came with the making." "The husband didn't hurt," Clara had said. "No," Emma had agreed. "He very much did not hurt." The second child came in the spring of 1884, a girl this time, dark-haired like her father, with the wide, wondering brown of his eyes, and a disposition from her very first hours that suggested she had arrived with specific plans and a timeline for implementing them. They named her Rose Eleanor Sutton, Eleanor for Micah's mother, and from the moment she arrived she made James recalibrate his position in the household in ways that were, for a 3-year-old, philosophically significant. He adapted with the grace that was apparently his character. Within 2 weeks he was bringing Rose small offerings, a wooden block, a piece of grass, once an entire biscuit from the kitchen table that he delivered with such solemn intent that nobody had the heart to correct the trajectory. By the end of a month he was her fiercest champion, informing anyone who asked that his sister was very good. Emma held Rose in the evenings while the light came through the large windows she had insisted on, and the creek ran below, and the prairie spread out in the late summer distance. And she thought about the small girl she herself had been in Missouri, before the fever took her parents, before the years in Wichita with the needles and the silk thread and the other women's dresses. She thought about how that girl had not had enough soft things to protect her, and had learned to be soft herself as armor, and how the strength inside the softness had been the thing that carried her through everything, and how it had taken a man in a livery doorway on a spring morning in 1879 to see both parts in the same glance and find them both worth admiring. Micah came in from the evening work and sat beside her on the bench under the window and looked at Rose in her arms. "She's making plans," he said. "She absolutely is," Emma said. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your expression," Emma said. "That concentrated look." "That concentrated look gets things done," he said without apology. "I know," she said. "She'll be formidable." Like her mother, he said, and it was not a flattery and not a performance, just a simple true statement delivered in his direct way. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The evening light came through the large windows and lay across the floor of the house they had built together, above the creek on the plains of Kansas. The life they had made extended in every direction. The store on Front Street with its straight shelves and Ruth's presence and Daniel growing into something genuinely valuable. The ranch with its solid winter herd. The house above the creek with its 2 children and its Sunday chess and its kitchen full of morning light. The correspondence with Clara Webb and the friendship with Mrs. Pierce, and all the small and genuine threads of a community that had become home not because she had been born to it, but because she had arrived and worked and stayed. And beside all of it, through all of it, the steady presence of Micah Sutton, who had seen her on the first day, not through the softness, not past it, but with it and behind it simultaneously, both things at once, and had said nothing, and had quietly and completely admired the whole of her from that first moment forward. She had spent so many years being carefully managed, carefully presented, the softness arranged precisely over the strength to smooth everything down. She had done it well. She had made it a skill, and it had carried her through things that might have broken someone less capable or less determined, and she did not regret it, because it had been what she needed and she had always given herself what she needed. But here, in this house, in this life, with this man and these children and this view from the window, she was not hiding anything. She was simply herself. The soft parts and the iron parts and everything between them, all of it present and all of it known and all of it, somehow, loved. Outside, the Kansas evening settled over the creek and the cottonwoods, and the last light went from gold to rose to the blue of coming dark, and James could be heard in his room narrating something to himself in the absorbed monologue of a child who finds his own company engaging, and Rose made the small sound she made when she was almost asleep but fighting it, and the creek moved below the house as it had always moved and always would, steady and clean and utterly indifferent to time. Micah's hand found hers. She turned her head and found him already looking at her, and the warmth in his eyes was the same warmth that had been there from the beginning, from that first quiet Tuesday morning question at her store door, unchanged by time and children and seasons and the accumulating weight of a life fully lived, if anything deeper, more certain, settled into the permanent the way a river settles into its course. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. "By considerable measure," he smiled. "The full one. The warm one. The one that had first appeared complete on their wedding day and had since become one of the most familiar and beloved sights of her daily life." She settled Rose more securely against her chest and looked out at the darkening prairie and felt, from the top of her head to the soles of her feet, the full and unhurried joy of a life that was hers. Built by her hands, held by someone who saw all of her, growing in ways she could not entirely predict but was not afraid of. The iron was still there, exactly where it had always been, running right down through the center of her. It had never needed hiding. It had just needed finding. And it had been found at last completely.